Before we get started with our conversations, please kindly ensure that your video and your audio are turned off during the dialogue and the conversations that we will be having with our panelists. And of course, there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the dialogue with the panelist. Really, our goal is to make sure that this dialogue is engaging and interactive as possible. So there will be a time for questions and answers after the conversation with the panelist. If you do have a question, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, turn on your camera when you're speaking, and if possible, direct your questions to a specific panelist. Alternatively, you may submit your questions via the chat throughout the event, and we will address many of these as time allows us during the Q&A. And so thank you so much for being here, and we are looking forward to having an insightful discussion. And so please, at this point, if you could allow me to introduce our panelists. We have with us Steph Snell, who's an executive director of Tales of Tanning. And we also have an old friend. I'm not sure if I can still call her friend because I haven't seen her in about 9 years. Ms. Nkata Kochauke, who is the programs director and an interim executive director at Oxfam South Africa. We also have one of my favorite young people in this entire country, Moeketsi Kauhela, who is the co-chair of Y20 South Africa. And last but not least, we have Amahle Imvelo Jaka, who is a digital activist, an entrepreneur, and a current affairs commentator. So you would see that we really have a diverse panel, and we are hoping that through this moment they would really help us to have a very rich conversation. But before we get to the actual dialogue among our panelists, I would want to invite our panelists just for 5 minutes, if you would help us reflect on why this conversation about polarization in South Africa matter, and both symbolically and practically. And what does addressing polarization mean for us as a people? What does it mean for us as a society? And why is this discussion essential for us as a collective? So I'm going to start with Moeketsi because he's my faith. Moeketsi, I'm giving you 5 minutes just as an appetizer, help us think about why this conversation is important for us to have as a people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bunolo, Program Director, and to my fellow panelists, and of course to the colleagues who are joining us for this very important panel discussion on polarization, right? And I kept on thinking, what does dialogue look like in these difficult times that we are navigating? Program Director, to answer your question, and just from my own perspective, really, as I reflect, with regards to the importance of polarization in these difficult times, as I said earlier on, I'm going to speak, of course, from a person who is young, but also, from the perspective of someone who also works, in what we call the youth development space, if there's such a thing in our country, right? And for me, I'm thinking here about the young people who chose, and I don't have the specific stats, but the young people who chose not to participate in elections last year, right? Like, what do we make of them and their choices, right? And for me, I think it's important we start there as to how do we as young people, at this particular time. And in fact, one of the things I often ask myself whenever we conduct civic education work or whenever we do work with our young people through the Y20 is, who are the young people who are not here, right? And also, who are the young people who are meant to be here but are not here because of structural impediments, right? And what are the ways in which in their communities they're also experiencing these divides, whether at an economic level, a social level, and so on, right? And I think for me, part of why it's important, not only symbolically, but also practically, in having conversations like this, particularly with us as young people. I think with us as young people program directors, that we're often told that, the past is done and all those things. But in fact, I would beg to differ to say, contrary to what we have learned, the past is not done and the past is not over. In fact, as Toni Morrison puts it, it's in process, which is another way of saying that when we critique the past, when we analyze the past, and when we, it yields new information about itself, right? So I think for me, at a symbolic level, part of this country, 31 years into democracy, is that we really have not adequately, thought about, particularly at a policy level, how we transition our young people from being dependents to being independent, right? And what does that mean in these current times that we're living in, where, again, for those of us who follow the news, plus minus 3 weeks ago, if not 4 weeks ago, Stats SA would have released, the quarter labor survey. And again, it's us as young people who are making the loudest noise in those surveys, right? Or in those statistics. And as I wrap up, I'm reminded in 2011, program director in Tunisia, when a young man by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi, decided to set themselves on fire after a police person or a policeman, harassed them, given the fact that he was apparently, selling illegally, was trading illegally at the time. And, that would spark, of course, what we now study in history as the Arab Spring, right? And recently, I mean, most of us here, we live in the, southern region, and we know what's happening in Kenya. We've seen certainly what's happened next door in Mozambique. We know what's happening in Zimbabwe. We've seen what's happened in Nigeria, particularly with the, what is it, NSARS and bad governance and all those things. But, if we saw that what the Arab Spring did, with the, and of course the toppling of governments in those nations like Egypt, Libya, and so on, and some of the Middle Eastern countries, colleagues, are we perhaps at the tip of the Southern Spring? And I raise that because I think it is important and links to the question that's been posed around why it's important to speak about polarization at this particular time, because we also saw what happened in this country in July 2021. Right? And we've certainly seen in the plus minus 3 to 2 weeks, some of the, marches that have been, going on in KZN, and of course, it's different circumstances, but we know what's going on. And I think that is the point I'm trying to get to, program directors, that young people know what's going on, right? And really what that means is that, that needs to then say we need to move away from these perceptions that, oh, young people are despondent, right? We are not participating enough. But speak to young people on the ground, or however we conceptualize the ground, right? Young people in communities who are active in their communities, whether through civic education workshops and so on, and are talking about these things through their own community dialogues to say, we see what's going on, and something must give. And what that is, I'm hoping that this conversation will help us unpack. Program Director.
Thank you, Mwakete. I like that. I like that you took us to a place where it almost reminds us that we are part of a bigger story. The reflection that you've made about NSARS in Nigeria, Arab Spring, what currently is happening in Kenya. It really reminds us that this moment calls us for action, and I'm hoping, as you said, I'm hoping that this conversation will help us do that. But there's also something that you said, which I found striking, quoting Toni Morrison, that the past is not done, is in process, and I think that helps us to locate what is currently happening in our region and in our country specifically, and locate it to the past, and almost, and I hate using this expression because I feel like it's been used a lot, and almost reimagine a kind of South Africa that looks different from our current reality. Thank you for those reflections. I'm going to hand over to Steph. Steph, you've got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Bonolo. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to be talking about this subject. Manolo introduced that notion of, along political, racial, and economic and ideological lines is the kind of thing of polarization. I think what's very interesting, or certainly from a Western perspective, is that trauma and sentiment is not generally associated with polarization. And I think feelings are really, really important. And I think that's what Toni Morrison is sharing with us, is that we carry those feelings with us regardless. Not just necessarily yourself, also intergenerationally, that trauma is passed along. So one of the definitions of polarization says the division into sharply contrasting groups or sets of opinions and beliefs. And why I'm saying that is I want to focus on the word division. Because there's a lot of stuff is associated with polarization, and division is certainly part of polarization. I think that what's really important to recognize is that division is also a very powerful tool of politics, and it is what South Africa has experienced, that whole divide and rule thing. It's standard operating procedure when you want to dominate somebody, whether they're an enemy or an ally. If domination is what you seek, then the easiest and the most effective way is to divide them amongst themselves. So there's a natural tendency to create division. Interest groups pursue that division because it serves their interests. So I think that's one of the things that we got to keep in context when we think about this. The other thing is that there's polarization between almost everything. In fact, it really is as part of, if you like, an extension of the duality of life. So there's always opposing. There's always one side and another, and the real issue is how do you work with that? How do those two opposites, how do they harmonize with each other? And more recently, there's obviously, it's been mentioned, there's polarization between sexes, between generations, between the people on that side of the road and then the other side of the road. There's a whole psychology of in-group, out-group stuff that drives things like anything from the beginning of gangsterism, the kind of kids on the corner versus the kids on the other corner, right through to xenophobia. So if we live in this duality, the question is, how do we live complementary as opposed to divisively between each other? And that's, for me, is a key thing. So just going back in our history, there was a couple of mechanisms that you probably all know about, but there was the Cadessa negotiating mechanism that was to try and overcome polarization. There was the National Peace Accord, which was to try and hold things together while that negotiation process was there. Then we had first democratic elections, and then there was this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was another thing. But then, the thing of hope or good intentions versus realpolitik come into play. And then, as Mokitsi said earlier, everybody knows. So everybody knows that there were deals made behind the scenes around the Truth Commission. And there were agreements that things got swept under the carpet, etc. And that almost happens in all circumstances when the key players become involved. But in terms of the extent of fracturing that's happening, so let's say there's multiple polarizations happening at the moment, or happening today. I think there's a view I want to share with you all, and maybe it's because I'm of that generation that I have this view and that I can observe it. Is that back in the day, narratives were contained in containers that had a lid, had a top on it, and all authorities needed to do, whether it was a corporation or a government, it doesn't really matter, was to kind of keep the lid on that narrative and keep that narrative away from it, to contain that narrative in a way that they like to see it come out. So what happened, if you, for an analogy, if you think about a CEO with his sunglasses and big cars and maybe security guards, there's this veil, there's this thing of you don't know who that person is. They look powerful, that kind of stuff. But what's happened with social media is that those narratives, those jars that contained narratives are now sieves. So the youth are informed. They know exactly what's going on. In fact, often the youth know much more about what's going on than older people do. And that is the issue we're dealing with. There's nobody to hold it together anymore. And the only way that it's going to be held together is between each other, between people. And that's why I think this national dialogue is really, really critical. Bonolo, is that you telling me I've spoken enough? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steph. I wanted the record to show that you said young people know a lot more than old people, and we shall quote you. As much as I'm not part of the young people demographic, I like to pretend that I am because I like them a lot. But there's something that you said which I found very important, and part of it is because we keep gaslighting each other and invalidating our feelings. This idea that, you know, trauma is often not associated with polarization. And I think once we understand that, we will not gaslight each other and gaslight ourselves about our feelings, about the current state of our country and the ways in which we are experiencing democracy in South Africa. And you're right, we see that also manifest in various ways, particularly in ways in which we also relate with those that look different from us, you know, be it racial lines or be it with Black Africans that are not South African. And I think that's a very important conversation to have. I like that. And hopefully as we continue, you'll help us reflect more on that. And so I'm going to invite Nkateko. Nkateko, you've got 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Program Director, for this insightful discussion, and congratulations to Democracy Works Foundation for bringing this very important conversation to light. Why is it important? Firstly, I think we cannot avoid confronting the fact that we still very much look at conversations that avoid fully naming the political economy of resistance to redistribution. This conversation also cannot happen in a vacuum from, you know, the colonial legacy of the country and apartheid, and understanding, of course, that this has a role in shaping how we see things, in shaping our political experiences, but also when we don't engage in resistance to redistribution conversations based on our past and our history, is we then rob ourselves from locating this kind of notion around trauma and sentiment as well, because all of this is around, you know, understanding how elites continue to bargain, masculinity politics and how they manifest in communities, but as well as, you know, the shifts in technocratic governance that we see in today's world. Now, I come to this conversation, Bonolo, as well, still being able to identify as a young person, although the window is closing. But I also come as a woman who's experiencing South Africa's democracy as well. And one of the things we need to understand about polarization is that it's essentially the outcome of a decreasing economic and political optimism as we see it. And it's got a history, as I've mentioned before, and there's a lot of things that are playing out that young people are engaging and grappling with on a daily basis. Growing distrust in government's ability to govern effectively, echo chambers created by social media, distrust also in how mainstream media is also crisis reporting all the time, which really cultivates how we then experience democracy. But also what I want to highlight is how we've looked at our political parties and essentially only placed the role of, governance and addressing or leading state-led reforms solely in the vacuum of a state-citizen binary. I think we can expand our thinking a lot more right now. This conversation comes at a critical time because also, for the first time since our very young democracy, 29 to 30 years later, we are seeing governance as we understand it change. We now have a coalition government, which means that how we've known ruling party ANC for all these years since our democracy has also changed. And so where there's such changes is also understanding that the natural shift is that, or the force of nature is that power, the power vacuum essentially creates this anxiety that we see in how we're experiencing democracy. And that change as well has facilitated a lot of unanticipated shifts, introductions of political parties such as MKP and others, but it's forcing us to see how we can reimagine democracy. And so locating that sentiment aspect, understanding the political economy of the resistance to redistribution, which we still continue to experience, becomes essential in terms of how we then, as young people, choose to show up in a democratic environment that we want to see ourselves play a role in. And so I want to say that we should be asking ourselves about this notion of whether South Africa is highly politically polarized, and whether this notion as well is what describes our current environment. And I'm going to unpack a little bit more later about what I mean by this. But essentially, Bonolo, my last point of call is, as we discuss and engage in this conversation, is that we cannot talk about justice without addressing transformation. So I look forward to the engagement throughout this discussion. Thank you, and over.
Thank you, Nkateko. You said quite a few things that are important, and I think that one of the points that you made, which is very important, around you not just being a young person, but also being a woman, and I may add a Black woman, right? And I think this is also important because the different demographics, of course, experience South Africa very differently. Our political experience is very different, given what in social science we call political cleavages, right? And so I like that point, and maybe hopefully you can help us later to really also center these different demographics and ways in which they experience polarization, but also experience South Africa. But also one of the things that you said, which is a conversation that we've been having, and not just in South Africa, is the increasing political dissatisfaction, democratic disillusionment, but also just generally the trust deficit among young people. And this we see it manifest after every 4 years when we go into electoral periods where young people are deciding to boycott the polls, and that tells us something. And so I like that reflection. Thanks a lot. I'm going to hand over to Amatle. You've got 5 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Can everyone see me? Excellent. So I want to speak about polarization from, a youth perspective and a digital kind of lens, right? Because I was often plagued with a question. I have a brother who's 10 years younger than me, and we had a very big fight about why he didn't want to vote. And I quickly realized why, we have this outlook that the youth isn't involved in politics. And so through my platforms and content creation, etc., these are some of the things that I've realized,
why
polarization exists from a youth perspective, right? So from a youth perspective, there's almost this understanding that they are two different South Africans, right? So the youth kind of feel shortchanged. They were told to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And now that they've done all those things, they see that there's actually so many more inequalities and challenges that they still have to, or rather hoops that they still have to jump through, right? There's inequalities in jobs, in education, and in opportunity. So a lot of them kind of almost feel like, you know, the system benefits a small elite while the majority of them are excluded. So why be involved in politics in general? And it's kind of created this divisions along class, race, you know, geography, where do you live? And, you know, politics has somewhat become very personal and causes this division that Steph touched on quite early on. And then there's the second point that I've noted is that there's a kind of like a mistrust between generations, in the sense that many young South Africans feel like, you know, the leaders don't listen to the youth or don't understand their reality. You know, the older generations have this kind of commentary, and we see it a lot from comments made by Gwede Mantashe and so forth, that, you know, the youth are ungrateful, the youth are lazy, they are impatient, you know, which kind of reinforces this generational divide. Then we get to this understanding of this digital and social media world and how it creates polarization, and how social media has somewhat become, you know, this double-edged sword, where it kind of gives the youth a platform for them to engage and have these discussions. You know, as it was said, the youth often know more than the older generation, but at the same time, it almost also fuels these toxic and polarized debates because of all these other things that they feel, and, you know, kind of like this dissatisfaction that they have with democracy that was promised to them, you know. And so these algorithms on your TikToks, your YouTubes, whatever the case may be, kind of feed the users more what they already believe, which can deepen this us versus them kind of conversation. And then they also, you know, kind of feel slightly shut out of politics, you know. And this is something that I realized when I started creating content that kind of dumbed down politics for the youth, is that, you know, the politics and current affairs and governance and all these things kind of always feel like complex systems that feel inaccessible and elitist. And one of my beliefs is that that's because, you know, there's a lack of education on how politics works at a high school level. You know, I first only learned the systems and the branches and the different levels of government in depth when I got to varsity, you know. And so even when the youth do care about deeply complex issues like unemployment or GBV or, you know, climate change, they often feel powerless and almost feel like they don't have access, you know, to these formal channels on how they can actually make change. And then we have, you know, identity politics in South Africa, and this feeling of othering that is so prevalent, in the sense that there's polarization because there's conflicts around race, around gender, around sexuality, around nationality, you know. So we see, for example, young activists, or rather issues such as xenophobic narratives being spread online that kind of pit poor South Africans against foreign nationalists, instead of kind of addressing systemic inequality or addressing issues like, you know, why our borders aren't secure, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, polarization is pretty much, you know, it's quite a real thing in South Africa. And I was reading a study by Edelman that was published in 2023, and it had found that South Africa was one of 6 deemed very polarized countries, with 61% of South Africans agreeing that the country is very divided. And the cause of this division is, you know, the lack of employment, rising inflation, food shortages, energy shortages. Our problems are many. I could go on forever and ever. But one thing I have realized is that if we want to move away from, you know, a polarized society, we have a very big job ahead of us. And I think Steph touched on this, that polarization is powerful because it thrives on divide and conquer logic, you know, and it makes us forget that we actually have more in common than we think. And that if we, for me personally, and this is why I use my platforms, if we break down politics into everyday language through podcasts or TikToks or whatever platforms, we can kind of shift the power back to citizens. And that, you know, democracy only works when people feel part of it. And so my job as an activist is to, you know, feel young people, make young people feel seen, heard, and informed, and kind of lead to the change that we need.
Thank you for that, Amatle. Just listening to you, I mean, I love that you use social media platform to really raise awareness, and as you just said, that to also engage about everyday experiences. And it takes me back to this phrase that was coined by the 1960s, 1970s student activism movements, that the personal is political, and the political is personal. And I think that's very important. Some of these things that you've highlighted really speaks to this idea that the personal is very political. And I hear, some of the stuff that you highlighted about, essentially that young people feel like they were sold dreams. Because, as I mentioned earlier, that the quality of democracy as it's experienced by citizens, and in particular young people, tells a completely different story. But later on, I do want to pick up on something that you have said, Amatli, about the power of social media. If we think about what happened in Kenya last year, I think one of the things that young people in Kenya taught us, and also in Nigeria, actually, during NSARS, that taught us about the power of social media and how they use social media as a platform to really hold the state accountable. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I digress, but a couple of weeks ago, I was in Kenya, and one of the street vendors was shot by a police officer. But when the camera caught the police officer, he was looking away, and young Kenyans used AI to kind of turn his face so that he can easily be identified, and that's how he got arrested. And so, artificial intelligence and social media and these digital spaces really provides us with an opportunity to engage more and well and effectively. But of course, as you said, it's a double-edged sword, because it also presents opportunities and spaces that are very concerning. And I want to pick up on that conversation later, in particular when we reflect on political polarization in South Africa. Thank you for that, and thanks to all the four panelists for indulging us. So I'm going to now go ahead with the dialogue, and if I may ask all the panelists to please turn on your cameras, because I would like us to engage together with your camera on. And Steph, I'm going to start with you, and I want to tease you and say you are the senior citizen here. And so I wanna start with you, and not just because you are the senior citizen here, but also from a point of institutional memory, and given the work that you have been doing. You started by really helping us earlier on by establishing some sort of a framework on what polarization is and what that looks like. And so maybe you can then help us understand the road South Africa has taken from the post-apartheid era to today, in terms of reconciliation and promoting social justice. Thanks. And you've got 3 minutes to do that. You are muted, Steph.
That's another thing with old age, is being muted. I suppose it's also being young. So in terms of what you're saying, I mean, I mentioned earlier those mechanisms that were involved in trying to overcome polarization through the CODESA process, through the negotiation process, and then the National Peace Accord, and elections were obviously like a very big point, the first democratic elections. And then the TRC, which was such a compromised thing, where deals were made beyond the public's eye, and that was quite sad. And I think that a lot of pain persists because of that, because of what happened there. And we've had this sort of project, I suppose, of reconciliation, which really has just been on the surface. It hasn't dealt with any of the fundamentals. And social media has certainly kind of drawn that out. But I think there's something else we must be cognitive of, is that there are forces outside South Africa that are invested in self-serving outcomes for themselves. Those forces are also engaged in the opposite of, are also engaged in activities that promote polarization. So it becomes the thing of cohesion, of cohesion becomes it's something we have to fight for. We think that polarization is just happening because of our sentiment and our feelings, but there are, as I said, there are interests that push polarization, and it's a tool that is used. I mean, it was a colonial tool of note. That's how colonialism succeeded, was through being able to divide and rule wherever they went. That gets played out today all the time. We must be woke to that. Then the cohesion part, that's where do we find that common ground? And that's only going to be through dialogue. And this national dialogue that's going to happen is very much kind of focused in the old school way of doing dialogues, which was more like political education, if you like. And this national dialogue is going to be made, if it's made, it's going to happen on social media. Social media will determine the outcome of the national dialogue. One of the sad things around that is that a lot of people don't understand what's possible in social media around this. It's all kind of more fear orientated, and of course all the different interests are going to play out during that dialogue, and that dialogue is planned to end 2 months before the local government elections. So the kind of political charge within that's going to be huge, and it's going to be a huge place for contestation. And I think from civil society perspective, the real key thing is to deepen the conversation online. It's not about attacking people. It's not about making them wrong. You all know that all you do is you exponentialize that conversation. That's what's got to happen. We have to become activists online, and the youth need to take that space. Otherwise, it's going to be owned by the extremists. You know, there's this 1:990 ratio in social media. Just to give you some, it helps to shape your thought around what's happening in social media. So the noise is made by 1% of people in social media. The other 9% interact with that noise. The 90% are quiet and they watch. So when you understand that, you also understand that the 1%, many of those people are themselves, they are projecting their anger, their trauma, if you like, onto the world. It's like the evidence that in the kind of gender-based violence field, the evidence is that those men who act out and hurt people are themselves hurt. They are incapable. So how do you, in that continuum of how we need to break through those things, we need to see through these things, and we need to find each other in a way, in a real way, and that's only through deepening the conversation. There are no band-aids. Politicians will try and smooth things over but the ball is in the youth's hands right now, and it's up to the youth how we're going to go forward.
Thank you for that. And now that you've again centered the youth, I want to invite Amatle here. Amatle, building on some of Stefan's reflections, I want to hear from you because our stories are important, right? And so I want to hear from you from your own lived experience, your own story, your own cultural perspective, but also from the perspective of the work that you do, how, polarization has manifested itself in your environment in particular. And as I mentioned earlier, if you could also reflect on the usage of social media. Yeah.
So I think I loved that Steph touched on the fact of the outside influence on South Africa, because this polarization is not unique to South Africa, and we're kind of seeing the influence of these big countries like the United States becoming so polarized and how they've influenced us. And there's almost a sense of regression in how South Africa became this poster child for democracy and freedom, and is kind of regressing into becoming extremely conservative and and just right-winged, if you will. And I also want to use the example of gender-based violence. So for me, it kind of shows up in our political conversations online. And it's extremely scary when it shows up online, because let's use GBV4 as an example, right? It's a very big crisis in South Africa. It's clear as day that it's something that is wrong and it's a human rights violation. But once we get online and we start having these conversations, you kind of have this split in comments, right? And some people become extremely defensive, saying not all men and women are exaggerating, while the other side is almost demanding that there's, a systemic change. And so you find that the dialogue moves from addressing the issue itself to becoming an online battlefield where people are picking sides, and survivors' voices are getting lost in this noise, or whatever the case may be. You've got the older generation that frames GBV as like a private issue, or blame it on how women and how they dress, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in general, whether we're discussing GBV or elections, people have almost gotten into this understanding that they need to defend their side with everything in them online. And I think it was Barack Obama who had made this example about how algorithms in general and this online community that we've created feed more into what you already consume, right? So this is idea that if you are left leaning, you Google Egypt, you will find things about the Arab Spring. If you are in the center, you Google Egypt, you will be told about holidays in Egypt and going to see the pyramids. And if you are right-winged, you will be fed information about, just in general, what's this thing called? Terrorism and all these horrific things. And so social media becomes this intense space that kind of, for me, requires us to engage in media literacy and become, a little bit more intentional about teaching people how to decipher, what is true and what is not. But at the same time, it also has become this platform that the young people are using, to kind of get their voices heard. And, from my perspective, I use it to get them more engaged in it. It's dumbing down these complex topics for them to understand. And for me, what has been the most jarring is having a range of people, from my mother's parents, my mother's friends, saying to me, "Oh, your daughter explained the State of the Nation address so well." So this is not just almost a youth problem or an age problem. It's actually an education problem. From my perspective, that we can have all these national dialogues all we want, but if we've kept our society stupid and unable to actually engage in meaningful conversation, then we're kind of almost going round and round in a revolving door of no solutions. Yeah.
I like that. And I want to bring Weket here. Building on what Stefan has said and what Amatle has just said, and I know that you wear two hats here today. Someone who does a lot of youth activism, but also someone who does a lot of work in academia, but also in your capacity as the co-chair of the Y20. I wonder if you could kind of help us reflect on, and again, this idea that you are representing a generation that grew up in democracy, but continues to face unprecedented challenges. Do you see your generation primarily as victims of polarization, or as potential agents of change? Somebody said something the other day about young people, and it has to be explained in context, because this is a Black older lady that grew up in the village, and she said, we must stop seeing young people like they're guavas. When guavas are in season, they're everywhere, and there are ants everywhere, they are smelling. Now you want to get rid of them because these guavas are everywhere. And so even when this conversation about centering young people is important, but there's also what Amatle said, there's also this idea that, young people are seen as problematic, right? And so I want you to help us think about, do you see your generation as primarily victims of polarization, or do you see your generation as that which will be will provide, you know, the kind of change that we see, and really affirming young people that they are not guavas?
No, thank you so much, Bonolo. No, we are certainly not guavas, and we know that. But here's my thing. I mean, when you also look at research indicates that by 2050, I mean, Africa, this continent that we're in, and where we're having this conversation on polarization, young people will be the largest demographic in the continent, and certainly that's the case in South Africa, right? And we should be everywhere. So just to even build on what Steph said, and slightly on what Amahle left us on when she was wrapping up on the national dialogue. I mean, I increasingly start, I've been thinking, this national dialogue is here. The president has made an announcement on it, right? And I know, young people are also saying, another talk shop, it's a political ploy, it's a this, it's a that. But what is our youth agenda going into the national dialogue, right? There is unfinished business. And I think Steph, talks about this when, talks about the TRC and all those things. There is unfinished business that we, that our parents, left us with, that we must finish, right? You certainly saw that with the roads must fall movements, your fees must fall. And again, the July unrest, but again, we are also known as the protest capital of the world, right? We do not take to the streets because we are bored, we've got nothing to do, but because we understand fundamentally that we need a new language, we need a new social, contract, as it were, right? So I think for me, and also part of us, with us as young people, and this particular generation. I mean, I was thinking, last year, when was it? Yeah, 30 years of democracy, State of the Nation address by the president, and spoke about this, fictional character to sort of like, Dintswalo. And I thought to myself, I mean, Dintswalo is a useful analogy, but I was thinking about the Dikeledies of the world, or the Dikeledies of South Africa who live in the informal settlements, right? Who face the GBV that Amahle is talking about, right? Who are at the intersection of, and we know of them. I mean, look at what's happening in informal settlements or in townships like Alexander, Deep Sloot, and, right? So we are everywhere, and we should be everywhere, but also mine is to also say, and here's the thing, we don't see ourselves as victims. I mean, and the dogmas of the past, colleagues, are inadequate to the stormy present, right? And this is where we come in as young people to say, yeah, we're not in apartheid. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge, the past injustices that were committed as beautifully captured by the preamble of our constitution. But we are saying we need to deliver now on the dividend that we spoke about. The 1994 dividend, let's deliver on it, but also what is going to be our 2025 dividend, right? Because also I think certainly in the spaces that I'm in, where I'm working with young people, we're also thinking about questions of how do we also meet the needs of the present without also compromising the needs of future generations who are coming after us? Because we are certainly not naive enough as well as young people to think that we're going to be young forever. We're not. Right? So for us, that is why, for me, it is also important that as we, address this issue of polarization or these divisions, that are even captured in the, the barometer reports that the South African reconciliation barometers that they always release every year. It is up to us as, young people to say, the national dialogue is here, right? Or there are opportunities like the Cool Politics Café. What is going to be our agenda, right? What are the policies that we're going to mainstream, right? How many of us have actually engaged with the national youth policy, right? Have we actually tracked the changes in the national youth policy? Where are we in the national youth policy? The Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, right? What are you doing, right? Institutions that have been are given, fiscal budgeting or funding to do youth work, what are you doing? Right. So it's also important for us as well to not see ourselves as victims or no. We also need to shape this present. We're not just the future. We're also the present, and we need to mobilize ourselves and conscientize ourselves and certainly organize ourselves to say, We're facing issues of climate change. We're facing issues of inclusive economic growth and of course, unemployment is the hugest thing. But what are we going to do about it? And perhaps, and I think I'm in agreement largely with Steph, right? That we need to use this moment of the national dialogue. We need to talk. We can't just sit in the corner and be like, yeah, no, it's for adults, it's for this political parties, for this movement, it's not for us. It is for us, right? If the national dialogue is saying, after the first national convention, we'll go into the district municipalities, let's raise our hands as young people and say, I will hold that a national dialogue myself. Train me. I'll be a facilitator. Bonolo is there. She has plus minus 2 decades worth of experience in facilitation. Amahle is there, right? In social media. Amahle will take care of social media. Steph will come in with that intergenerational knowledge. Ngateko will come in from Oxfam and say, hey, I have funds, young people. Hey, young people need money. Hey, implement accordingly. So yeah, that is me. We're not victims. In fact, we're at the intersection. Yeah, thank you, Bonolo.
Ketoko, where's the money? We want the money. I really like what you said, and I agree with you, Moike. It's one of the things that I've been ranting about, particularly when I think about the quality of democracy in South Africa. I'm convinced that a generation before us that was fighting against democracy, they weren't thinking about a generation that was not born yet. And so it was one of those that we want to get ourselves out of this mess. And so now they're living their best lives, right? They wanted democracy and liberation and freedom, and they have it because they were not thinking about a generation that's not born. And I like what you're saying, that in the efforts that you are making, you really must think about a generation after you. Because in the next 20 years, I will be 60 years old. I'll probably be living somewhere, sipping nice glass of wine and feeling like, you know what, I fought for this continent. It is time for me to rest. And I don't know how old will you be, but my nieces and nephews and your nieces and nephews need to be able to carry on from where you started. And so being very clear about your agenda and being very clear about when you're demanding a new social contract, what is it that you are actually demanding, but also are you prepared to get your hands dirty? And I really like that. Nkateko, I want to bring you here, and I want to kind of take the conversation to you know, almost this same discussion, but slightly different. And given your work at Oxfam in particular, you know, I mean, we know Oxfam as a globally, Oxfam as an institution, an organization that really have done significant work on inequality. Every year there are reports on inequality, and I want you to really help us reflect on how, you know, inequality in South Africa is fueling polarization, and how is this, you know, polarization specifically affecting socio-economic.
Thanks, Bonolo, and thank you to the inputs from my esteemed panelists. I mean, it's been exciting to hear your input, and I'm quite excited and encouraged to hear that we're talking a lot about the different issues and how they are impacting us at different points. But based on your question, Bonolo, you mentioned inequality, and we need to understand that purely framing inequality as an economic or technocratic issue essentially sidelines the structural power dynamics that we are dealing with as South African. And this also facilitates the exclusions that we see. The conversation now spoke also around GBV issues. I mean, for South Africa itself, femicide remains 5 times more the global average as we see it and as people experience this. Yet, when you look at the manifestos of our political parties as we've come to understand them now, they are falling very silent on this issue. In fact, GBV has essentially been relegated to the domain of safety or criminal justice, right? And when we do that, we isolate ourselves from seeing, you know, the intersections with employment, the intersections with mobility, and these economic empowerment, for example. And these are the areas where young people have a keen interest to interrogate. So Inequality helps us see the intersections of the various socio-economic issues that we are grappling with as young people, but as a nation as well. And so we can't necessarily bracket it into just an economic issue or a technocratic issue. We need to broaden our horizon because I mentioned earlier on that we're not really looking at, the nature and embeddedness of this resistance to redistribution. Since we came onto our journey of democracy 30 years ago, when you look at and experience the landscape of our politics, power hasn't truly shifted. When we talk about GBV purely as a safety or criminal justice issue, we're not seeing women and youth as full players within the value system of economic transformation, if I may use that concept. I've also had the privilege to engage in a study commissioned by Rivonia Circle and supported by the French Development Agency, looking at whether the GNU can essentially address inequality in the country. Now, Amahle Mvelo, you mentioned something that resonated with me earlier when you said we really need to also look towards the points of commonality as we grapple with crisis concepts such as polarization. I think it's quite important for us to guard ourselves not to sink with the sand. Because the more we deepen our understanding of what it means, the more we bracket it into a theoretical or conceptual issues, is the less and less we see the human elements and potential for thinking about what a human economy could potentially look like. And so this study sought to really unpack to say, as a nation where we find ourselves now with this power vacuum, ANC faces less power, 40%. DA looks at 22% in terms of its power sharing, and others who have come in formulating the GNU as we understand it. However, when assessing and unpacking the manifestos of these political parties, an interesting observation came out for us, and we've also engaged extensively from the point of inequality with this research report. But surprisingly is that there are various common areas that are points of convergence across the political parties that we can cite. I mean, issues around land reform, issues around education, healthcare, economic freedom, for example, or economic transformation, if I may frame it as that, have become actually points of convergence for the different manifestos of the political parties. While they fall silent on the GBV aspects and the feminist lenses, that's the work that as young people we need to actually be doing. That's the spaces where we show up to engage what this looks like. But I wanted to reference this because I'm highlighting that we also need to move our thinking towards saying, as young people, how are we leveraging the new political landscape? How are we looking at those things that connect us rather than divide us? And also there are lessons in terms of, has South Africa's democracy worked? The center has held because the underpinning aspects of your voters' rights, an outcome of a free and fair election has actually demonstrated that it's still holding. It's fragile, but we have a role to play in terms of keeping it together. And so as young people, to come to Mweketi's point around, are we agents or victims, is essentially we must understand first that based on our legacy and history is that we are managers of colonial and apartheid outcomes. And as those managers, it means we have a role to play in shaping what the future is. While Mweketi killed my dreams of remaining young forever, I truly resonate with him when he says, we need to build a pathway that secures a future for the next generation of leaders. So what should we do? Essentially, in these spaces, particularly where electioneering is happening, we really need to also take our efforts seriously as we get into the local government elections and then the new cycle of the general election as well, because we are dealing with this fragile state of politics. It's holding, but it's fragile. Is that one, we need to engage the democratic process at all angles. We mentioned the national dialogue coming up. It's a moment, but we need to sensitize or socialize among young people the importance of not looking at political or democratic participation as a moment, but as a process. So your IDP processes is where we need to be making noise. Legislative processes, provincial legislative processes is where we should be making noise. And so my call to action here, Bonolo, in response to your question is, democratic participation is not but a moment, but a process that young people should be engaging in to enable them to have a holistic, bigger picture lens of our democracy and the role that they play. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nkatakwa. I really like where you landed. It's a process, right? But there's something that you said earlier that reminded me of a comment that Professor Kolela Manguan said many years ago when we were battling with xenophobic attacks. I think I stumbled upon this reflection from him around 2012, 2013. And this is to the point that you were making, that we must not just look at inequality as an issue of economics, right? He was talking about xenophobia and saying that the economic reasons for xenophobic violence do not go far enough to explain the viciousness of violence that we see in South Africa. And I like the point that you made, that this is these issues are interrelated, right? Inequality is not just only rooted in socioeconomic rights. But I also like the call that you're just making, and it would have been so great, maybe as a follow-up conversation, we can have policymakers as part of this conversation, right? Because I think all of us here agree that there's something that needs to be done. And you're saying that the center is still holding. It's fragile, but it's still holding. And we don't know when it's going to collapse. And we can't be waking up later when we are a failed state and pretend that we weren't seeing this moment, right? So we are able to read the moment and what this moment calls us. But we can't do that alone here as members of civil society, as members of the academia. And so this is a challenge to Democracy Works Foundation as well, that perhaps in part of this series, convene a conversation with policymakers and with non-state actors. But I just want to take us back a little, just before we transition to the last segment of this conversation. We've got about 3 minutes or 5 minutes left before I open up a space for questions and answers. And so I'm gonna give this to you. Let me give it to Amahle. I just realized, and it may be a bit too late in the conversation to bring this up. I should have brought this up at the beginning, but I just want you to use a very simple language to explain what polarization is, because I think everyone here does understand what polarization is, but if you were to use think about when you make your content and you want to make sure that the consumer gets this content. Yeah, go for it.
So for me, it's almost like a Kansas City Shuffle. I don't know if you guys have ever watched Lucky Number 11. It's a movie. It's kind of a situation where I make you look left while I do things on the right, right? And I think our leaders are very much involved in the polarization, and we'll use xenophobia as an example, right? Our leaders love it when the focus is on the fact that there's so many foreign nationals in South Africa, right? Because it takes away from the actual issue, which is, why do we not have systems set up in place, to protect our borders and then to get people into this country legally and with the right documentation? So my understanding of polarization is this idea that you divide and you conquer, And you know, and I think Steph touched on this, you separate the people so they can never come together and form opinions together and realize that our anger and our, you know, just general distrust is directed at all the wrong people. There was a book that I read years and years ago that kind of explained, you know, xenophobia to me so well. It's called The Cape of Good Hope. And this guy travels from Kenya through Tanzania, and he makes it all the way to South Africa, and it's 2008, and that's when we first get our xenophobic attacks. And he had some good insights into the reason he was being attacked was because his shop would open at 4 a.m. in the morning, because he has no other option but to make it work in South Africa, right? And so he gets the first influx of people who are coming to buy, you know, goods as they're on their commute to work. And that's kind of turned over into, oh no, these people are taking our jobs. When the reality is that the government is not implementing enough policy and strategy to create jobs in this country. And it's diverting away from the fact that a lot of corruption is happening in this country that then results in that lack of job creation. Because if we're going to create jobs, we have to build infrastructure. It's a song that is sung at every State of the Union address. So if I were to explain polarization, I would literally say it's a Kansas City shuffle. I make you look left while you look right. It's what's happening in the United States, in Germany, in all these other things where people's frustrations are being manipulated. And so then you see the rise of right-wingism or fascism to say that you have to blame the other person for your problems, as opposed to looking at the person who's actually in charge and saying, why do I have these problems? And that's why polarization obviously also comes with a lot of migrant issues. And, you know, it comes a lot with a lot of, you know, well, women should dress more conservatively if they don't want to be attacked, or it's the youth shouldn't look to the government to give them jobs. They should become entrepreneurs and they're expected to be these hustlers. But the reality is that we don't have access to funding or you know, access to assistance through all these institutions, by the way, that exist, because these institutions are corrupt. And so that's kind of my understanding of polarization. It's this basic divide and conquer, so that we don't focus on what the actual real issues are, and we kind of attack each other as opposed to pointing the finger at the people who are actually in charge and who are meant to solve these problems.
Thank you. I like that. And I like the example about xenophobia. It's because it has been used as a scapegoat, and it works perfectly for politicians. So each of you have spoken about the national dialogue, right? And because this is an important moment in our country, you know, that we wanna talk to each other. So we don't have much time. So it is now 15:17, and by 15:21, if you are still talking, I'm going to act like a dictator and kind of step in. So I'm going to give each of you a minute and to reflect about the national dialogue, that you share your views on how we can make our national dialogue process more effective and create greater local ownership. So Steph, let me start with you, you know, from your localized evidence-based approach to reconciliation. What are some of the ways in which we can make the dialogue process more effective and create greater local ownership? And then from Steph, I want Mweketsi for you to step in and really reflect on, with the national dialogue process, how do we ensure youth voices are central to this process? Nkateko, how do we move from policy and from a policy and development lens, how do we build a dialogue that actually delivers results? Because people are now saying, you know, we can't feed the hungry, but we have money to have a conversation. And I think we have money to have a dialogue. And I think what will help us, if you can think about from a policy and development lens, how do we build a dialogue that ensures that the results are delivered? And then Amatle, I want to land with you from your cultural and social commentary perspective. What do you think we need to do to ensure that this process is more effective? Steph, I'm going to hand over to you. So I'm not going to come in right after Steph, Mweketsi, Nkateko, and then we'll land with Amatle. Thank you.
Thanks, Manolo. For me, the national dialogue, it's on social media. I'm working with civil society, and I would like to see that civil society really come together to take charge of the national dialogue, particularly on social media. And that needs the involvement of hundreds of organizations and potentially thousands of dialogue facilitators. That's where the place is to go. I'd like to see a dashboard that reflects the conversation daily, available to all the organizations and news outlets so people can track and have interest in the conversation as it develops. And that the participants become the shapers of the national dialogue. My main thing is really we need to focus on social media and make it work on social media. Thank you.
Mwaketsi?
No, thank you so much, Manolo. So, I mean, I think for me, just to give a practical example of, the ways in which, I mean, in my introduction, you would have also noted that, I lead the National Youth Coalition. So, I mean, essentially what we did to make sure that, in fact, youth meaningfully participate in the national dialogue. So one of the ways we do that is that we actually reached out to, the preparatory task committee, that is for the national dialogue, to say, how can young people actually, what does meaningful engagement look like here? And they had shared with us, the various themes of the national, dialogue. So the overarching themes that have been shared in the public. They have a website now where you can access this information. And, so these are, constitutional and governing architecture. You've got building a new economy for prosperity and so on. And what we've moved to do is that, out of those 5 themes, through the National Youth Coalition and other, youth coalitions in the country, we've actually subsequently, developed, 19 over, sub-themes from the main national dialogue themes. And we said, young people must be lead discussants, right? Young people must write 3 to 4, non-academic papers, no jargon, simplify it. What's your opinion on this matter? What does it mean for you as a young person in Deep Sloot when we're talking about building a capable state? What is a capable state, right? What does it mean when you say want to build, economic concrete enablers for the economy and so on? So that is part one, really, of the ways in which we've made sure as the National Youth Coalition specifically, but also even as Y20, our involvement there to make sure that, again, young people's voices are mainstreamed across, whether you're in an informal area, the township, suburbia, the inner city. So that is just, but one suggestion, in terms of the ways in which, we've made sure that youth voices remain central in the national dialogue process. Yeah.
Nkateko?
Exciting. I think to drive the point I want to make, I have to make reference to the G20. I don't think that it will make sense without. So the G20, as we understand it, has no enforcement mechanism. It's a multilateral process where 20 countries come. They deliberate on the rules that they want to see unfolding in terms of the macroeconomic landscape and how the 20 richest countries in the world can shape that state of play at that level. They meet once a year and they walk away, they go to another year again. The enforcement frameworks for whatever comes out of the G20 is found in other processes, such as the UN Financing for Development Conference, COP30, which is coming up in Belém later in the year, and what else? I can mention a few. UNGA, the UN General Assembly, for example. That's where UN Tax Convention, for example. That's where you give life to what gets discussed at the G20. So with the national dialogue, a commendable process that sees us talking, But it's time now that we have practical results. How are we thinking of advocating and advancing a practical enforcement mechanism that takes forward the outcomes of the dialogue itself? This has to be a policy conversation. So as movements, as young people, as the Youth Coalition, Mwekezi, as you think about these engagements, there is, what do we want as an outcome from the national dialogue? For too long, we've been engaging in conversation as a country, but we also need to practically embed this in process as well as in policy proposals. That way, we can then have a role as young people in terms of monitoring implementation, but in terms of working our way to being those agents who are also enforcing and implementing some of those key commitments that are coming out of the process. So that's my proposal, Bunolo, for us to think about what can we come out as a practically enforceable framework that would take the outcomes of the national dialogue into policy making and policy implementation moving forward. Thank you.
I like that. Thank you. Amatle?
And I think just to get the youth involved in this national dialogue, and I think Steph touched on it, is obviously leveraging social media. I mean, social media can't really necessarily, replace real world dialogue, but it can be the door. And I also think in just leveraging the institutions that we have that exist already. So for me, if you've got the Department of Sports and Culture, Arts and Culture, we need our Sia Kolisis, the people's captains, and all these people that are famous in this country kind of also engaging in this national dialogue, and everyone understanding that this has to be pro bono because we don't need to spend more money on this, right? We need, these champions of South Africa that we look up to start going into these small communities, to creating dialogues at school. So to just borrow that idea that we need everyone to write down what they would expect out of this national dialogue, what they want out of this country. It's going to need some form of advertising. And that advertising is not necessarily going to come from government because nobody trusts or likes the government. So we kind of have to use the tools at our disposal and say, okay, how can we get former Miss South Africa, Tamron Green, to speak to her community and engage about the national dialogue? And I feel like these are all things that are within, government's reach, utilizing all these kinds of different people to get people talking about it. It just always kind of ends up with, now so-and-so was paid 100,000 to go speak at a school, and then it shifts the whole thing and makes it negative. Yeah. If you want young people to engage with the national dialogue, speaking at them about the fact that there is a national dialogue when they already have so much distrust against the government is not going to be the solution for it. We kind of have to leverage celebrities, people of importance, to kind of also get involved, because it's not just about winning a Rugby World Cup. It's not just about Banyana winning whatever. It's not just about a Tebe Magugu having a show in Paris. It's now about, he now has a factory in South Africa. How does he now get involved in the national dialogue? And I think once we get that kind of involvement, pro bono, I need to stress pro bono, yeah. We don't need to spend any more money on this. I think, it will help facilitate all these other things that we've been speaking about today, to move from just conversation into action, and then to get young people involved as well.
I was just about to say, I'm convinced that you have access to my notebook. Because one of the things I've been ranting about, especially as someone who comes from academia, is this idea of using non-textual tools for democratic building. And what are those non-textual tools? Music, art, sport, food, fashion. Do you know what I mean? And even in the history of South Africa, I mean, if you think about sports in South Africa, how sports unite us. If you think about music and the work of your Jonas Gwangwa, Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, what their craft did for us in international law, right? And so I've been obsessing about this idea of taking this conversation away from us, the ones that like to make noise and discourse, and gather musicians and winemakers and chefs and artists in one room and have a conversation. I really, really like that. And again, here's a challenge to Democracy Works Foundation. Perhaps one of the series have a winemaker and a chef and a sportman and a musician in one room to have a conversation. Thank you so much, guys. I really, really love this conversation, but I want to now open up space for anyone here who may have a question. Please raise your hand so that I can see you. We want to hear your voice. Okay. It doesn't look like there's a, oh, there's one. Oh, yes, yes. Professor Rekgotsofetse. I really like this name. Rekgotsofetse, you've got 1 minute to ask your question or make a comment. Thank you.
It's dangerous to give people the opportunity to make a comment. I'll refrain from that. Thank you so much for today's presentation. I mean, I really liked the conversation. It was also a bit frustrating. So this is a good faith comment, by the way. I'm not trying to disrupt for the sake of disrupting. But my question, I would have like two questions. One is, what do we mean by polarized? And the inverse of that question is like, what does it mean to be united in the country? Right. So what would that look like that would make us feel satisfied that we're no longer polarized, right? Because if you have a democracy designed for people to disagree with each other, for people to be different without society falling apart. And the last time I checked, South Africa's institutions haven't necessarily fallen apart that there's a civil war. There's 100% challenges. But what would that unity look like that makes us feel appeased? Which leads to the second comment of like, what would the end of a national dialogue look like that makes us all happy? And when I say all, I mean every single South African must walk away and be like, yeah, you know what, we had a good time and we're now very happy with the state of the country. I don't know if that's possible. And my organization has kind of been part of the preparatory team for the national dialogue. And one of the big questions has been, how do you make everyone satisfied? And at the end, it's impossible to do that. Otherwise, you then don't have a democracy. So for me, it is, what do we mean by polarized? And then more importantly, what does unified kind of look like? And that'd be great to kind of get insights into those two questions, because I think it helps answer a few things. Thanks.
That's a good question, actually. I like that. And Nkateko, do you want to take that? I know you are about to dash out.
Yes, in the interest of leaving to another meeting, I want to invite the colleague who posed the question to please come and visit us at Oxfam, because we're trying to figure out what that outcome for the national dialogue would be. And hence my point earlier on when I said, what is that enforcement mechanism do we want to start thinking through and advocating for its entrenchment, because it gives us a solid foundation to hold key players accountable for the commitments that emanate from the process. So I'm very keen to work with organizations who would like to figure that out. What does unity look like? I think I mentioned it earlier as well, to say the moment as young people, because now we are the next generation, the next leaders coming up into the political space. It be civil society, I mean the political economy space. We are the people that are going to take care of it for the next 30 to 50 years at least. And so we need to be careful of sinking in the sand when we look at issues around polarization from a state citizen, black and white binary, where we're focusing and investing a lot on the trauma, unhealed trauma, by the way, for South Africans, that is very much informed by our past and our history. So where do we begin to focus more intentionally on those points of convergence, those points of commonality in our politics and in our day-to-day that help us collectively craft solutions? I worry that the way in which the media also is increasingly crisis reporting and shaping the discourse is creating some disheartened people. And so for me, it becomes equally important to play a role in narrative framing. What role are we playing as young people to change the narrative from deficit reporting to more a progressive and solutions-orientated narratives? And lastly, Bonolo, it goes to also how Africa has just been seen as, the dark hole of the global South. But until we create African literature that tell the story from the contributions, solutions that we're bringing to the table, it will not stop being looked at from that lens. So that's my offering around how, as young people, we could potentially move forward in terms of grappling with the concept of polarization, but tipping it over to identify and focus more on those common areas that bring us together. Thank you.
Thank you. But to the point that also Kgotsofetse was mentioning, I think we must also disabuse ourselves from the need to have the answers to everything, right? And so even when we, like the point he was making, which I think it's a very important point, and when he said it, it struck something that will we ever come to a point in the world where we completely agree and are completely united? And I don't know. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I think polarization will always exist as people. We are individuals with differing opinions. I think the degree to which polarization becomes an issue, right? So we do live in a society where everybody, as a democracy, always has said that everyone is entitled to each of their own opinions and we won't always agree. But critical thinking becomes very important when you can be able to listen to the other person's perspective on an issue, for example, and take it in and not necessarily always have this us versus them, which is something we see quite prevalent in the United States, right? That's why it is the most polarized country, where Democrats and Republicans can't even work together because they've built themselves as us versus them, whereas governance, is supposed to, if we look at portfolio committees where you've got all these people from different political parties, their own political ambitions are supposed to be lesser than the greater good that is supposed to occur. So to say that, and if you speak about the GNU, the DA and the ANC should be able to put their differences aside for the common good. And so polarization, I believe, will always exist. There's no society, there's no utopia where we will never have a polarized society, but the degree to which we are polarized is heavily dependent on how educated a society is, the ability to think critically and be able to evaluate certain scenarios. So I might not like this black cup, but we can both agree that this black cup stores water and keeps it cool, and that's good enough. And you might want a white one. That's okay. And so I think when we're speaking about polarization, let's be careful not to go to this land of like doom and gloom where we're now a society that just doesn't agree.
Yeah.
But more so, to what degree do we disagree? And I think that becomes prevalent when we look at inequality. Unfortunately, there will be polarization if the majority of people don't have access to water. But if you look at those Scandinavian countries, they're less polarized because they become socialist and everyone is kind of on the same wavelength. So their disagreements aren't as big as the disagreements you find in South Africa.
Thank you. I like that. Bokang, please keep it brief. We are running out of time. Bokang, are you still here? I see you. There you go.
Okay. A good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Bonol. So, Amahle mentioned something earlier on, like how our leaders don't really listen to the grievances of the youth, something like that, or they don't really understand the youth affairs. So my question is directed to Mr. Kwahela. So Mr. Kwahela is a co-chair of Y20. So what do you think, what kind of strategies do you think can be employed in order to ensure that youth voices are heard and valued in decision-making processes despite polarization? Thank you.
Thank you, Bokang. Charmaine?
Hi, thank you so much. Mine is more of a comment more than anything. I think I agree with the first speaker who posed a question about polarization, as well as when there was a comment about how we should have different people in the room, such as musicians or chefs, and I think it's good for inclusivity. But also, South Africa generally lacks a unifying national vision or goal. So unlike other countries, we generally struggle to foster a strong sense of unity or pride. Our cultural storytelling, especially through music, has shifted a lot. It used to be a powerful tool for like connection and consciousness, but it no longer reflects, our shared struggles or aspirations. If today we were, asked to write a song for one of our musicians, I don't know if we'd be able to do that confidently, because we're more into dance and just having a good time, and we sort of, we're not talking about the issues that young people face through music or other arts more than usual. So yeah, I just wanted to put that comment in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. But I must tell you something funny about music and the dance in South Africa. So part of the work I do is in different parts of this continent. And 4 years ago, every time I go to a country, they'll be like, oh, so you are from the country of Madiba. But now they don't ask me that anymore. You know what they say? They say, South Africa offered us Amapiano. And so everywhere you go, so this dance as well, it's what unites us.
Definitely. Thank you.
That was a question directed to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for us, so one of the key strategies that we are certainly using as Y20 is making, like, literally getting young people to shape policy, right? And I think that links to what Nkateko said around how do we, yes, it's important to talk about the challenges and all those things, but what are those implementable policies that we can come up with as it relates to climate change and environmental sustainability? What do we mean when we say want to lead a just energy transition? What does AI look like in the context of South Africa? But also, what are the ethical considerations we need to consider around AI, right? Given that, yes, there are pros, but also there are, disadvantages to AI. So for us, really, one of the strategies that we are employing, our program director, and to answer the colleague who posed the question, is making sure that young people are getting involved in policy. How? By negotiating. So as the Y20, we've got 5 thematic tracks, right? Climate change, environmental sustainability, inclusive economic growth, inclusive social development, AI, meaningful youth engagement, and reforming multilateral organizations for a just future. And in essence, young people are in those rooms. In fact, as I speak right now, young people are negotiating towards, that imagined future around, all those 5 thematic tracks, but also proposing the solutions that will find, life in some of the institutions that Nkateko mentioned on UNGA and all those things. Because yes, whilst the G20 might not be, might not have a permanent secretariat and not have an enforcement mechanism, but all those countries also sit in other multilateral processes where those policies, can be implemented and actioned. And that is really our key strategy as this particular Y20, not only being inclusive, but making sure that our young people are negotiating for their future in the form of policy. Program Director.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to our panelists. I think this has been absolutely incredible. And also to you joining us. I think we can agree that the fact that you are here with us, it's a labor of love and a commitment to this country. And it gives me hope. I keep saying that and in those days when I used to be a preacher, I would look at the work of King David in the Psalmist, where he will lament, and then after lament, he will land at a place of hope. And I think we've been able to do both of those things here in this conversation, where we've been able to lament, we've been able to think about really practical recommendations of how do we take this forward. And I think this moment also provides us with a sense of hope that us here, we are part of a people that are doing something to, as I said earlier, to build a South Africa that looks different from our current reality. And someone once said that democracy really depends on the quality of public discourse and the willingness of citizens to engage with one another across their differences. And we've been able to do that here. And so thank you so much for joining us. Let's continue having the conversation. To Democracy Works Foundation and Y20, thank you for convening us. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bonolo. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
How do I leave? Oh, there we go.